From KUNC and the NPR network, this is In the NoCo. I'm Erin O'Toole. Picture this. It's a summer day. You're on a ship on the Arctic Ocean. You scan the horizon, and you don't see any sea ice on the surface of the water. For much of our history, this would be a surreal scenario. But a University of Colorado researcher says that vision is going to become a reality. And the first day that we have an ice-free Arctic Ocean may be closer than we think. Dr. Alexandra Jahn is an associate professor in the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences at CU Boulder. She's part of an international research team that used climate models to predict when the first ice-free day in the Arctic could occur. Alex says that day could happen within 20 years and possibly in as little as 3. She thinks that image is going to shock the world.
It will be a really stark contrast, seeing this transitions from this very white Arctic to now a blue Arctic. That will be a really big and stunning impact on people.
Alex spoke to me about how her prediction is getting lots of attention from climate scientists who have been thinking about this scenario and what the consequences would be for the planet. I want to get a sense of what the Arctic normally looks like. You know, what we call the North Pole is usually covered in sea ice all year round. It melts a little bit, though, and recedes in the summer months, right?
Yeah, that's correct. The Arctic has the most sea ice in the winter time because that's when it gets really, really cold. But even in the summertime, we still have ice in the Arctic covering about 25% of the Arctic Ocean currently. But that used to be about 50% if we go back to the 1980s. So that's been a big and very clearly attributable loss to climate change.
Alex, you've been studying the sea ice in the Arctic for years. What made you want to try to determine when the first day without ice might happen?
Yeah, I've been looking at that for a long time, kind of how the sea ice is going to change in the future. But I got interested in looking at the projections of the first ice-free day when I realized that the first ice-free day is almost inevitable in our lifetime. And so thinking about, okay, when that is going to happen, what is that going to look like? And the realization was that it's going to happen on a day. We're going to have a satellite picture that's going to show us this ice-free Arctic. But all the projections that we have to date are for the first ice-free month. And I thought it wasn't really probably very clear to most people that we're making projections of the first ice-free month rather than the first time we would actually see ice-free conditions.
Okay, so there was something more powerful about thinking about an ice-free day rather than a month.
Yeah, because that's going to be a very powerful image, I think, when we see that satellite image of an Arctic that is practically ice-free for the very first time.
I have to say, the first ice-free day in the Arctic sounds like a pretty ominous milestone. To study this, you and your colleagues created and studied some 300 different models that use climate data to predict future conditions. What did you find?
So what we found is that the first ice-free day could occur anywhere between 3 years from now to over 50 years from now. And the mean is around 25 years in the future. Mm-hmm. And that is on average something like 6 years earlier than the first ice-free month.
Help us understand, what's the impact on ice-free days on the ecosystem in the Arctic?
So we're already starting to see impacts on the ecosystem in the Arctic with the 50% ice loss that we already had. When we get to practically ice-free conditions, we will have lost 86% of the summer sea ice cover. Mm. So that will just amplify the effects that we're already seeing. The Arctic Ocean waters are getting a lot warmer because the ocean is much darker than the sea ice that used to cover the ocean in the summertime. And so more solar radiation is absorbed in the ocean, like a black car that gets really hot when it's parked in the sun.
Yep.
So the waters are getting much warmer, and we're already starting to see some fish species migrate into regions of the Arctic Ocean that they couldn't live in before, and kind of displacing some of the fish species that used to live there. So they're invasive species in the Arctic. We're also already seeing impacts on some polar bear populations. because they depend on sea ice for hunting, and that has led to some polar bears already starving or trying to swim to the ice edge where they expected it to be and to actually drown before they reach the ice.
Oh, gosh. That's such a terrible image. I want to zoom out because we know in the southern latitudes, warmer oceans can fuel more powerful hurricanes. Would an ice-free Arctic affect weather patterns in a similar way?
Yeah, so that's still a really active area of research of how exactly this different new Arctic is affecting the weather patterns. Some studies are showing that it affects the jet stream, making it more wobbly. That can bring hotter and drier weather to the western states in the United States, especially the northwestern states or Washington State and Oregon. And that makes these hotter and drier conditions make that region more fire prone, and so can lead to more wildfires because the vegetation is just much more dried out by the fall season.
I mean, that's something I feel like we're already seeing happening just a bit.
Yeah, we're definitely already seeing an increase in fires.
Well, Alex, as I mentioned earlier, this sounds like a very ominous milestone for the Earth. Is this ice-free Arctic inevitable?
It almost is. The only way that it can potentially still be avoided is if we manage to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Under that scenario, there's some model simulations that show that ice-free conditions could still be avoided.
Okay, so it sounds like it really depends on what happens with emissions in the future. What do you want people who hear about your study to take away from this?
I mean, I think the Arctic used to be dominated by sea ice and snow, and so it was predominantly white even in the summertime. And changing that over a span of 4, 5, 6 decades through the emissions that we as humans put into the atmosphere to a blue open water ocean, it's a really big impact, and it's very clearly attributable to these greenhouse gas emissions. There's no way that we could have ever gotten to where we are today, and even more so to an ice-free Arctic, without the greenhouse gas emissions. I think it's just a very clear example of the impact that we have on the environment. Any emission reductions that we can do will lead to less sea ice melting. And so I think that's a really important thing to take away from this. Even if we cannot avoid an ice-free day in the Arctic, we can affect how long the ice-free season lasts. And with that, the impacts that will have on ecosystems, on the people who live in the Arctic and depend on the sea ice, as well as on the impacts that it has on weather in mid-latitude.
Does anyone see the melting of ice in the Arctic as a good thing?
Yeah, there's interest in accessing the more navigable Arctic already today. It's a shortcut from Europe and the east coast of the US to Asia. But I think overall, it's a net negative with all the impacts that this is going to have on the economy in terms of fishing impacts. As usual with most things, there's going to be winners and losers.
Dr. Alexandra Jahn studies atmospheric and oceanic sciences at CU Boulder. She's been researching when the Arctic might see its first ice-free day due to climate change. You'll find more information in our show notes and at kunc.org. That's it today for In the Know Co. I'm Erin O'Toole. Thanks so much for listening.